We came down from a tree in order to become humans. Our genetic ancestors are still there. That's why we feel so well in a forest. A forest is home. Trees are home. Vitruvius was the first architect that wrote a theory about architecture. He was a Roman architect, and when he imagined the original cabin, it was represented like that, with some trees supporting a triangle. Again, trees were home. I always wanted to be an architect, and I was building my first house in that tree, in the country house of my family. It has several floors. The house is not still there, but you can see the mobile home that we used to travel around Europe. I had my education with my family traveling around Europe. We were visiting incredible buildings from incredible civilizations, using materials like stone and brick in Roma, using stone in the Gothic cathedrals, using steel after the Industrial Revolution. So every civilization, every society built their aspirations with materials, with stone, with steel in their cities. When I started studying architecture, it was the moment when the Bauhaus school and the modern architecture was the most representative. With this diagram made by Le Corbusier, it was somehow defined the architecture to come, how a new material, the concrete, could transform, could modernize the old structures of brick, the heavy buildings that we have from the past. But also in the Bauhaus, they were defining what it was called the modern city. This was the representation of the modern city with blocks always looking to south, monofunctional districts, streets that were mostly focused for the car, the pedestrian segregation. So these drawings had an incredible influence in the years to come. The prefabrication with the use of concrete facilitated that after the Second World War, there was a huge explosion of urbanization, of construction, of social housing all over the world. And after the 70s, there was a huge also urbanization in Asia, and especially in China some years later. Mobility was also part of the plan of modernity. We transformed streets into roads or highways. So the street was more connected or more related to transportation, to the speed, than not to the social relations. And obviously, the impact in the territory was huge. So we have been living in a world that developed in a very efficient way a plan that was defined, a role model on how to make cities that was defined in the 1920s. And as you can see, the cement and the fossil fuel has produced a huge impact in the CO2 emissions in the planet. Some years later, I became chief architect of the city of Barcelona. When you imagine Barcelona, you imagine a wonderful city with great architecture where you can walk in the sidewalks, but you don't imagine that it's full of contamination. Many days it's difficult somehow to breathe, as in many other cities around the world. And this is the impact of this that we call economical growth. The idea of the economical development has created a huge impact in the planet. And then we discovered that what the science was saying in the 60s, in the 70s, and in the 80s was truth. That we have, that climate was changing, that we have a huge impact everywhere in the planet with fires, with the sea level rise, and so on. When we were starting to fight for the climate, then we need to start to fight for our life. But you know, being a chief architect of Barcelona has a very deep responsibility. You need to plan to the future. And when we thought in that moment of crisis how we should plan to the future, we need to look at the past. We need to understand the history, where we come from, in order to see where we want to go. If we don't have a long-term plan, what we do is business as usual. Everyone is comfortable just running the reality without making big transformations. But now is a moment for a big transformation. And the good news is that some people decide to start to act. Europe decided that by 2050, we need to become a continent of climate neutral, zero emissions continent. And then China also has agreed to become carbon neutral by 2060, and so on. But today we still live in cities like this. We live in cities that are emitting CO2, cities that are receiving goods from containers all over the world, cities that are built with concrete, that are using petrochemical to produce plastics, and so on. This is not a nightmare that came from the sky. This is something that we, as humans, we decide. We decide that for us, progress was like that. But this is not anymore the progress. We need to imagine what is progress now. Can we have a proposal for the future so strong, similar to the proposal that somehow had in the 1920s that supposed a radical transformation for the reality? We want to make cities like forests. We want that our cities absorb CO2. We want to produce food locally. We want to make cities that are using timber coming from the forests that are around, that are coming from their bioregions. Because if we are able to propose a solution that can transform the reality, we'll be able to save ourselves, we'll be able to save our planet. And obviously, we need to look at the planet like a whole and to understand the different singularities. The nature, the trees, has hundreds of thousands of years of evolutions. Architecture, you know, is only 10,000 years old. I'm sure that in 1,000 years, buildings will fly. Buildings will go. They will be incredible. They will be amazing. But trees are much more perfect machines. We need to learn from the nature in order to imagine our future. In 2020 was published an article in the Nature magazine, written, among others, by our friend Guallart Architects, that is one of the leaders of the Bauhaus of Earth, where he was trying to explain how, before urbanization, how the carbon was moving from there to the ground, how during urbanization we start to extract the carbon using coal and oil, and how we were using materials like masonry, concrete, steel, or composite in order to build our cities. But in order to define the future, we can imagine that we can use bio-based construction materials in order to store the CO2, store the carbon in our buildings. In the year 2000, we found the Institute for Advanced Architecture of Catalonia. Was the moment where the digital revolution arrived to us. It's the moment when all of us, we start to have cell phones. It was the moment that Google almost didn't exist, nor Facebook, nor Instagram, nor anything. But we wanted to explore how digital technologies will transform the way we make architecture and we make cities. And now we know. We are using robots, we are using big data, artificial intelligence, and so on. But now the new frontier is not anymore to be digital. The new frontier is become real natural. That's why we have created a lab here in the center of the metropolitan area of Barcelona. Again, everyone thinks on Barcelona as a very dense city, but as you can see, in the center of metropolitan area, there is a huge natural park. We decided to come back to the forest in order to learn what we forgot. And then what we are doing with our students is to try to learn everything that we need in order to develop this new kind of architecture. We are doing sustainable forest management in order to extract some wood every year. We are cutting that wood. We are drying these pieces of wood. We are using a small press to create CLT panels. And every year we do a prototype of a construction using timber that never came out from that forest. So that means it's very local constructions that are very well finished. And New York Times, for example, was talking about this building during the pandemic. This was built during the hard lockdown of 2020. New concept for an unpredictable future. But what is important for us is to imagine this new model. Architects in general, and in the last years, we have been masters of making a wow, making after the Guggenheim effect, architecture seems to be a kind of iconic activity. It was more about the form than not about the content. And this is not possible anymore. Architecture now must become an art, a discipline that is connected with the design of the whole process, understanding where is coming the material from, which kind of manipulation we do to this material, how we are going to transform that material in order to make new kind of buildings. We are working with the European Forest Institute that is directed by Marc Palaye in the so-called circular bioeconomy. And we can imagine that the circle is the whole planet, extracting wood from China, from Africa, sending to China, making some product and buying these products in Europe. Or we can imagine how we can develop local economies and bioregions using local wood in order to develop local buildings, empowering the people and empowering the local economies. And that's why the new technology that will allow this, that is allowing this, is the called CLT, the cross-laminated timber, because we can produce very, I would say, simple panels using small pieces of wood. The timber don't need to be the best of the best, and using these small pieces of wood, we can create these panels, and with these panels, we can create a new generation of buildings, of social housing for the future of everywhere. In the year 2020, the city of Barcelona also took a very important decision related with policy. It launched the first competition with the reduction of the price of bidding was giving only 10% of points, but the reduction of CO2 emissions gave 25%. So that means that they say, guys, we want to have buildings that are clean. We are committed to fight with the climate change, and we want to prove it that this is real. And then the policy is fundamental in order to transform the reality. It's not enough to make great speeches. It's important to take decisions, make new regulations, and then to apply. We applied to this competition with my friend and partner, Daniel Ibáñez, and we won it. We won it, and now we are we are going to build the tallest timber building in Spain, as you see, with bigger terraces that were designed during the pandemic. The biggest timber building has been built already in Norway, is still 18 stories high. And UK, some friends from Cambridge University, they are working on designing skyscrapers made with timber structure. So we are at the beginning of a revolution. You can imagine, we are at the beginning, we are like in 1850, when architects start to use steel, and then we can do incredible buildings, incredible things using timber. But the solution or the biggest challenges are not in Europe or in America. The biggest challenges are in the emerging economies, in the global south. In Africa, urbanization is happening. There is an accelerated process of urbanization. In the next 30 years, more than 1 billion people will be urbanized in Africa, will go to live to the cities. So that means that we are not over. I mean, we are in a growing process of urbanization, and the question is how we are going to do it. Are we going to follow the rules of the 20th century industrialized economies, or we can jump directly and going directly to the new ecological world? Cities in many times in Africa looks like roads that are kind of urbanized. And if you see to many places, the kind of construction that they are doing are like this. This is the material that they can produce themselves very easily. And it's incredible that we are trying to get out of these materials in, I would say, America and Europe, and we are sending these solutions, and we are contributing to these kind of solutions in these emerging economies. I was invited to make a project in Cameroon, and I am starting to do my first project in Africa. And then I had a discussion with the people, and I told them that I would like to make a radical proposal, that is to use the African timber for African buildings. And they say that this is impossible, that this is not happening, that they are building with concrete. This is what they know to do. And I say, this is not the future. We should think bigger. We should think on your kids. We should think on the planet, on how we are going to transform our realities. And we had great conversations, and at the end, everyone agreed that we are going to use local timber. Yesterday, I heard to the Minister of Cameroon was describing very well how they are using sustainable forest management. I was visiting the forest, and they are doing quite well. So we are going to use this local timber, and for me what is important is to think in a very systemic way. I don't want to make an icon. I don't want to imagine that we are going to do an exceptional solution. What I want is to find working with the people that know how to deal with this timber on how to create a new kind of industrialized timber construction, especially for Africa and for Asia. So this is the modular system we are going to use for our school, and this is the first phase of the school that we already start to build. What is important is for us and for the people that are promoting the school is that the education will be about mathematics, about languages, but also about the place where they live, the place where they learn. They will grow looking to these timber buildings, and we hope that in the future they will imagine how to use the same approach for the future of their constructions. But it's not only about buildings. The biggest challenge is urbanization. The biggest challenge are the cities. And that's why we have been working in a proposal that want to integrate many solutions in order to think how we could do something, a kind of new way of creating cities that are merging the principles of nature in order to make cities. It will be a kind of forest city that is not using anymore the traditional grid like cities like New York or Barcelona, but is using more like a kind of linear branched structure that can be adapted to any natural place, can be adapted to rivers, to forests. We want to make cities that are somehow growing with the forest. The fact of making a city must be an act of protecting a forest. We need to find this balance between growing and protecting. The only way to grow in a proper way is to manage the forest. And you see, the idea is that the first building that a city needs is a factory to transform the trees that we will manage from the forest to some material that we'll use for the constructions. So part of the challenge here is to work and to contribute and to collaborate for the education, for the development of technologies, in order to create a new kind of cities for this emerging world, where they can find the marketplaces that is what define many times what is a city, where they can find new forms of housing, where we can develop buildings that produce their own energy. We don't want to burn coal or oil to produce energy. We want to produce it. We want to use solar panels. We want to grow our food, the food near the cities. And what we would like will be to imagine how we can make cities with the same strength, with the same ideal of a better future that somehow was defined for the 20th century with a goodwill, but the result somehow was a catastrophe. And I think that in the limit we have two solutions, and that's why I say that the city of the future is a forest, because or we destroy our civilization, and then the forest will take over our cities in the same way that the Maya civilization was there, and now they disappear, and the cities are just pure forests. If we abandon a city, we'll grow a forest because the nature always came back. Or we need to define a new way of making cities that follows the rule of the natural systems in order to promote life and biodiversity. I think that urbanization can help to save ourselves and to save our planet, but we need to think in a smart way, and we need to work together in order to build a better future for all of us. Thank you.